In this lesson, we're going to cover some introductory photography topics. So this is basically Photography 101. This is the first part. We're going to cover lighting, exposure, and white balance. In the second half, we'll talk about composition. Let's get started. When we talk about light sources, most people think first of artificial light sources. You see some examples here of equipment that you would find in a studio. Other types of artificial light sources would include just regular lights that you would have in your home or office, like incandescent lights, fluorescent or tungsten lights. It would also include things like on-camera flash that can be used to light your pictures. One of the other big sources of light, natural light sources, the sun, which is what you would use outside, or even inside if you've got a nice large window and something you can reflect off of. When we talk about qualities of light, we think about its direction, whether it's coming directly onto the subject, whether it's being focused through a lens of some type to create a spotlight, whether it's ambient light that's bouncing off of things around it. We also talk about diffusion. If you're shining a light through something like a softbox or a filter, any kind of screen that's going to change the type of lighting. We also talk about the color temperature, and we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about doing the custom white balance. One of the other things you want to look at is modifying the light. You can use a reflector or a diffuser, move your subject into a place where the lighting hits them at a more flattering angle, and as you look at turning your subject, moving where you're standing, the perspective of the camera, to get the lighting style that you're looking for. Here you can see a simple lighting exercise that shows the way the direction and angle of the light changes the shape the model's face appears. And then when we get the light either very high above or below, it gives it a very striking appearance. We're going to do a little lighting practice here in a minute. There's going to be some exercises linked here in the box. Next, we're going to talk about exposure, including the exposure triangle, which is composed of the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. We're also going to talk about the artistic controls these different settings give you. So in this diagram, you can see the exposure triangle, and it shows how the different facets of exposure affect your image. So aperture controls your depth of field. The larger your aperture is, the more light you let in, but the shallower your depth of field is. With the shutter speed, the faster your shutter goes, the more you freeze movement, but the less amount of time you're allowing light in to your sensor. And then ISO, the lower your ISO, the clearer the image is, and the higher the ISO, it gets to be more noisy. So depending on how you want your image to look, you can change those factors. You just have to adjust them all so that you get that correct exposure there in the center. Our next diagram illustrates the different types of artistic control that those settings affect. So you can see there in the top row, your depth of field, if you want the foreground subject to be clear and then the background to be out of focus. You've got the example there with the nice wide open aperture. And there towards the other side, you see the foreground and the background both being in focus, and you have that really small aperture there with f32. When you're looking at your shutter speed, it stops the motion, so the fast shutter speed there with the figure nice and clear, all the way down to they've got actually a half of a second, and you can see that the subject is very blurry. Down here on the bottom, you see the grain factored in with the ISO, and the lower the ISO, nice and clear, all the way up to that really high ISO where it's very grainy. But how do you calculate exposure? So since I learned in the days of film, I would have a number of factors: how much light is falling on the subject, film speed, shutter speed, and aperture. So now that I've got a digital camera with a wonderful computer in it, I choose the factors that I want to control for my artistic expression, how I want the image to look when I'm done with it, and then I let the computer in the camera calculate the other settings so that I get the correct exposure every time. Now we've got some exposure samples. On this first one here, there are showing the depth of field in the first one there at f2.8. You can see it has a very shallow depth of field. Only the very first camera is in focus, and all of the other ones are out of focus. In the second example there at f22, all of the cameras are reasonably in focus. This is a nice technique you can use to isolate your subject if you have a focal point that you want to really stand out from the background. You would use a shallow depth of field, And then if you want everything to be in focus and you want to include more details in the background and the foreground, you're going to want to use a nice deep depth of field. Here you can see with a very high ISO, the grain is particularly visible here in the background camera. You can see how it looks like it's got a lot of little spots on it. This is usually not considered to be a good thing if you can see the grain, but in some types of photography you might choose to do that. And then in the next one here we see the motion with the very slow shutter speed, and I actually had to intentionally move the camera because the subjects in this picture weren't moving. This is usually a consideration with the motion blur when you're shooting fast-moving subjects such as sports. Next, we're going to do some exposure practice with the activities linked below. Now we're going to talk about how to set a custom white balance. In order to set a custom white balance, you're going to need a gray card. This is a pretty simple small one. You get a larger one, some of them have targets on them, which help with the focusing. You're also going to need your camera and your camera's manual. Each camera manufacturer puts their custom white balance settings in a different menu, and there's a different way to set it, so you'll need to look that up for your specific model of camera. The reason we need to set a white balance in our camera is because light comes in different color temperatures. So you see on the little chart here, it's got a nice clear blue sky with its color temperature listed, and then it goes from there, noon sunlight, and electronic flash, to very warm light like candle light. So when we want to set that white balance, and most cameras come with a variety of different presets which you can select if you know what kind of light you're going to be shooting at. You can do an auto white balance, which the camera kind of guesses what white should be. You can select daylight, cloudy, shady, tungsten, fluorescent, flash, and then custom. Some cameras even have more options than that, but those are the standard ones. And you can see the different color casts that it gives the picture there of the sunset. Sunsets are not really great for doing color correction because they can really be any color. But when you want to represent the accurate colors as your eyes see them in the picture, you usually want to do a custom white balance setting. So depending on the setup in your camera, you're going to shoot a gray card. When you shoot a gray card, you want to make sure that the gray card is facing towards your light source and that you completely fill your frame with the gray card. Now, autofocus won't work when you have completely filled the frame with a solid color like that. Unless you have a gray card with a target on it, you'll need to either manually focus or use your focus lock to be able to take the picture of the gray card. And then you'll go through your menu, your camera settings, and tell it to custom set that white balance to the settings of the gray card. Now we're going to go through and practice setting the white balance on your camera. We're going to take a little break now so that you can practice the skills that you've learned in the first part of this lesson. When we get back, we're going to talk about composition.